You should just rent a cheap apartment and live there. After all, someone who just stays at home doesn't deserve to live in this house, said Kelly, who had returned from the city. She was now trying to drive me out of the house where I was living with my in-laws, planning to take my place. My in-laws don't understand working from home, and my husband, who wants the house, is siding with Kelly. Together with Kelly, my husband Eric and my in-laws keep blaming me. Do they even realize who is paying the mortgage for this house? That's when it struck me. If I left, who would pay the $7,500 monthly mortgage? There was no reason for me to keep living with these people who made me feel so terrible. If they wanted me to leave, then I would leave. I had endured enough, and my anger had reached its peak. I'll change the ownership and mortgage to your name, I told my husband. With that, I divorced my overjoyed husband Eric and left the house. Little did they know they would soon face an unexpected situation. My name is Lauren. I used to live with my husband Eric, who is 3 years older than me. I met Eric while working at a company, but it wasn't the typical office romance. Eric worked for the cleaning company that serviced my office. When I met my husband, I had just lost both of my parents in quick succession. First, my father was diagnosed with an illness, and the doctors gave him only 4 months to live. While caring for him, my mother fell ill too, and despite her fight, they both passed away, leaving me alone. Having no siblings, I suddenly found myself all by myself, struggling to accept the reality that my parents were gone. After their passing, I would often think of them at random moments and tear up. However, I tried to hide my feelings from those around me who were being considerate. I forced myself to smile all the time while at work. The first time my husband Eric spoke to me, I was trying not to let anyone notice as tears welled up in my eyes. I stood in the hallway during a break, staring blankly out the window, lost in thoughts of my parents. I had seen Eric at work before, and we had exchanged nods, but we had never spoken, and I didn't even know his name yet. Eric approached me as I looked out the window and asked, "Are you okay? You seem a bit down." In response to Eric's gentle inquiry, I found myself talking about my parents. Maybe it was easier because he was a stranger whose name I didn't even know. When Eric heard about my parents' passing, he sympathized, saying he was close to his own parents and could understand the loneliness. I was glad that Eric listened to my story. After that, we started having brief conversations whenever we saw each other at work. And it didn't take long before we started meeting outside of work. Soon after, we started dating. Eric introduced me to his parents. As Eric had mentioned, he seemed to have a good relationship with them. His parents, aware of my loss, were considerate and invited me to visit them anytime. I quickly grew close to my in-laws, and without a formal proposal, it naturally led to me marrying Eric. After the wedding, we rented an apartment near my in-laws and started our life together. After getting married, I quit my job and switched to a company that allowed me to work fully remotely from home. I did this considering the possibility of having children with Eric in the future. I told Eric about my career change, but it seems he didn't quite understand it. For now, he just knows that I work from home using my computer. Since my salary didn't change after switching jobs, I decided to take care of the living expenses. Eric earned less than I did, so we agreed that I would pay for our expenses while Eric would save his salary, except for what he spent on social activities. Eric didn't have any expensive hobbies, and before we married, his social expenses were mostly just dates with me or going out with friends. Eric himself said he was okay with me managing our savings, so this is how we handled our finances. Working from home was all positives for me. Above all, I was happy that I could enjoy leisurely meals with Eric when he came home. This wouldn't have been possible if I were still working at my previous company. Before marriage, I often made simple meals just for myself, but now, wanting to please Eric, I find myself wanting to cook more elaborate dishes. Our life together was peaceful, but then a few years into our marriage, something shocking happened. My in-laws' house was completely destroyed in a fire. Fortunately, my in-laws were unharmed, but they lost all their possessions and irreplaceable memories like photo albums. For a while, my in-laws stayed in our apartment, and they were deeply upset. I wanted to cheer up the two people who had helped me heal from the loss of my own parents, so I did everything I could to care for them. I cooked, of course, and also took care of the household chores during breaks from work, making sure they felt comfortable. On weekends, Eric and I would go out with them. However, my in-laws felt like they were being a burden and struggled to regain their usual cheerfulness. They often mentioned that they couldn't stay with us forever and were concerned about imposing on us. So my husband Eric and I decided to build a house to live with my in-laws. Until now, my in-laws had never brought up the idea of living together, but Eric and I had been considering it. In preparation, I had been saving from my salary, separate from the savings my husband was making, thinking it was better to get a mortgage sooner rather than later. I suggested that we use this opportunity to build a house. My in-laws were delighted, and the conversation quickly came to an agreement. The house they had lived in was a charming wooden structure built by my great-grandfather. It had been fine when they were younger, but as they aged, they started experiencing various health issues. Therefore, they had many requests for the new house. Eric, too, wanted to add various features, thinking that if we were going to build it, we might as well do it right. Ultimately, the cost ended up being much higher than anticipated. Still, convincing myself that we would be living there for a long time, I agreed to build a house that met all three of their requests. I began to sense something was off around this time. Eric was excessively claiming to his parents, Rachel and Kyle, that he was the one building the house, and they were constantly thanking only him. Even though the house and the mortgage were in my name, and the down payment came from my savings, it seemed like Eric hadn't mentioned this to Rachel and Kyle at all. Because of Eric's insistent claims that it was his house, Rachel and Kyle started pressuring me to thank Eric as well. I appreciate Eric not just for the money. I paid more because I could, not because I wanted gratitude from Eric or Rachel and Kyle. However, even when Rachel and Kyle said things to me, Eric didn't stand up for me. Instead, he jokingly said, "That's right, you should be grateful to me for letting you live in a new house." I was definitely upset after hearing these falsehoods repeatedly. I understand that Eric has his pride, so I didn't ask him to tell his parents the whole truth, but I did ask him to stop making it seem like I was doing nothing. However, Eric, feeling more confident because of our new house, just wouldn't listen. Then I found out that Eric was telling a terrible lie to his parents. He incredibly told them he worked at the same company where I used to work, which is considered a well-known major corporation. True, Eric still has dealings with that company, but as I began to notice Eric's lies and his inflated pride, I started to feel increasingly distrustful of him. I also felt uncomfortable because his parents always seemed to favor him. Still, I thought once we moved into our new home, the issue of who built the house wouldn't come up anymore, so I just kept enduring patiently. However, once our new home was completed and we started living there, their attitude towards me clearly began to change. It seemed like my in-laws, just like Eric, didn't understand the concept of working from home. They thought I was just playing around because I didn't go out during the day and was always at my computer. Eric had been complaining to them that Lauren is just playing around all day, and they seemed to have completely believed it. Before we moved, they never said anything, maybe because they felt I was taking care of them, but the sarcasm increased as soon as we moved. They would say things like, "Eric built such a fine house, and you just stay in and play around. Must be nice. Why don't you work a little and help Eric out?" Even when I was working on my computer, they would come to my room just to make these snide Eric. The discomfort made me leave the house more and more, working from a cafe instead. I repeatedly asked Eric to clear up his parents' misunderstanding. While Eric might not understand the work I do, it's my salary that's supporting his and his parents' lifestyle. All I needed was for him to tell his parents that, but Eric just said, just let them say whatever they want, still not listening. Since they thought I wasn't working, I got stuck with all the housework, and his parents started bossing me around. I couldn't take it anymore and finally stood up to them. Eric was there too, and I thought he would finally take my side seeing how upset I was. But instead, he yelled at me, "Don't talk back." Then he thrust a completed divorce paper at me, threatening divorce if I didn't comply. I had never seen Eric so angry before, and his behavior completely intimidated me, making me give in to him and his parents' demands. From that day on, both his parents and Eric's attitudes towards me turned utterly cold. The only time I felt seen and could find some solace was when I was working at my computer. I immersed myself in work to forget the treatment I received from my in-laws and husband. One day, my sister-in-law Kelly, who had been living in the city, came back to visit. She was coming to see the new house and planned to stay for a while. My in-laws immediately started complaining about me to her. They said, "Lauren is always cooped up in her room playing on her computer. Does she even realize whose generosity allows her to live in such a nice house? What on earth is she doing on that computer all day? Playing games? Is she some kind of nerd? That's just weird. We don't really understand all this, but maybe she's one of those nerds. You think if she's always on her computer, she must be one, right? Isn't she ashamed of not working?" Trying to escape their loud conversation meant for me to hear, I went to my room. Then I heard something even more shocking. They said, "Wasn't Lauren just a cleaner at Eric's company? It's amazing how she lies about working from home. She couldn't possibly have the skills for that." Kelly was talking as if my and Eric's roles were completely reversed. Since Eric had told his parents he worked at a major corporation, maybe he had also lied that I was a cleaner. The real liar here was Eric. I wanted to tell this to Rachel and Kelly, but given everything that had happened, I doubted they would believe me, so I just gave up. Ever since Kelly came to visit, my place at the dining table was taken over by her, and I couldn't even eat at the same time as everyone else. While they ate the meals I prepared during my work breaks, I would be secluded in my room, continuing my work. This went on for a week, and the day for Kelly to return to the city came. But suddenly, Kelly declared, "I'm going to live in this house too. After staying here, I found it quite comfortable. I just quit my job, so I've decided to move back here," Kelly said. She had been working in the apparel industry but got tired of the office drama and decided to take a break. Her family home was being rebuilt, and when she returned and saw our new house, she found it more luxurious than she had expected. Leaving the city to start a business here could be good. "At my level, I can work from anywhere," she said. My in-laws, Rachel and Kyle, were thrilled with Kelly's words, and Eric seemed quite pleased with the compliments about the house too. However, there was no designated room for Kelly in this house. Until now, she had been staying in the guest room, but if she were to live here permanently, another room for Kelly would be needed, and the house had no spare rooms. Kelly had realized this after living with us for a week. She told me, "I'll live here, so you should leave," with a smug, malicious grin. "People who just play around at home don't deserve to live in a house like this. You should find some cheap apartment somewhere and live there." "No, this house is mine because I started to say, but Rachel cut me off. "That's a good idea. You do nothing but stay at home all day." Rachel sided with Kelly, leaving me no room to argue. I tried desperately to explain my job, but Kelly, who had just said that work could be done from anywhere, wouldn't understand about working from home. Just because I'm not going out, they say I'm not working. They're trying to corner me with such an absurd argument. After everything that's happened, I'm really starting to get angry. Eric doesn't try to speak the truth, just stands there laughing and watching the situation. Until now, I kept quiet, considering Eric's position, but I finally told Rachel, Kyle, and Kelly that this house was built in my name. I'm paying for all the mortgage and all the living expenses. The down payment came from my savings, and Eric hasn't paid a single penny. Seeing me speak up to this extent, Eric was clearly panicked. However, the only things that came out of his mouth were words to berate me and self-serving statements to hide the truth. He shouted at me, calling me noisy, telling me to shut up, and calling me a liar. Eric was obviously flustered, and it was clear he was hiding something. Yet Rachel, Kyle, and Kelly still defended him, calling me the liar no matter how many times I tried to explain. I said it wasn't a lie, but they didn't believe me. That's when it struck me, if I left, who would pay the monthly mortgage of $7,500? There was no reason for me to keep living with these people, enduring such unpleasantness. If this house is supposedly built by Eric, who works at a major corporation, maybe it should all truly be his. With that thought, I decided to sign the divorce papers that Eric had pushed on me, intending to threaten me. When I offered to change the house's title to Eric's name, he was so delighted he almost danced. He must have thought the house would now fully become his own in name and reality. He's not wrong, but Eric misunderstood one thing. Initially, to change the mortgage to his name, we tried to go through the process together, but Eric disliked the complex procedures and told me to handle it alone. Just you go and listen to all that complicated stuff. It's just a name change, right? Get it ready for my signature only, he said. Since that wasn't possible, I took the reluctant Eric to the bank and a legal professional for consultation. Throughout, Eric didn't listen to the explanations and just played with his smartphone. When it came to signing the documents, he finally became eager. If I sign this, the house will be in my name, right? He asked. After I confirmed, he happily signed the documents. Once all the procedures are completed, both the house and the mortgage will finally be Eric's. I've explained it several times, but I wonder if Eric has truly realized it. He was ecstatically reporting to Rachel, Kelly, and Kyle. Even after hearing this, how can they still believe that Eric works at a major corporation and I'm unemployed? I watched this scene with a feeling of astonishment. After changing the house and mortgage to his name, I filed for divorce. We're going on a trip to celebrate this, so you better move out while we're gone, Eric said. Waiting for the procedures to finalize, Eric took Rachel, Kelly, and Kyle on a ridiculous divorce celebration trip. They were apparently going abroad and wouldn't be back for about 15 days. During that time, I sold all the furniture and appliances I had brought into the house and packed my belongings into the car, ready to leave while handling various procedures in parallel. I was also looking for a new house and moved immediately after packing my belongings. The place I chose for my fresh start is the top floor of a high-rise condo. It was a stroke of luck that this condo worth about $8 million was available. However, given the timing, I thought it must have become available just for me, and I decided to boldly purchase it. For the past few years living with Rachel, Kyle, and Eric had been stressful, so I was thrilled about my new life ahead. In fact, I had an inheritance left by my deceased parents. I had been investing using that inheritance even before marrying Eric. Initially intended as just a way to earn some pocket money, these investments turned out to be a huge success, and now my assets amount to several $1 million. I had planned to use that money for a relaxed early retirement with Eric in the future. I had kept this asset a secret, intending to surprise Eric, but now I'm truly glad I never mentioned it. If I had told them, Rachel, Kyle, and Kelly might have joined forces to take my assets. Living with that family, I painfully learned just how careless they are with money. The house I lived in with Eric and his parents was decorated mainly based on their preferences, so it wasn't to my taste. With the move to the condo, I took the opportunity to create a space I love, carefully crafting the interior to my liking. Now it has become the perfect space, surrounded only by things I adore. Above all, there's no one around to make snide Eric, so I can happily work from home. Once things settle down, I'm planning to join a cooking class or yoga studio. Finally, in this enjoyable and free time, I have regained a peaceful mind for the first time in years. The call from Eric came the night they returned from their trip abroad. He must have realized that the furniture and appliances were gone upon returning home. He demanded them back, but I paid no attention. Everything was bought with my money, so it's my choice to do what I want with it. I didn't want to leave anything of mine in the house of those who had caused me so much suffering, not even the furniture and appliances. Of course, they were unnecessary for my new home. When I told Eric that I had already sold them, he still demanded I buy them back immediately. It's impossible. You, working at a major corporation, should just buy new ones, I retorted and then hung up the phone. That day, Eric called several times, but I ignored all of his calls. Months had passed since Eric and his family returned from their overseas trip. I had completely forgotten about my previous life and was having a great time getting along well with my neighbors. That day, I was returning from a cooking class I attended, invited by a friend who lived on the floor below. Suddenly, I received a call from Eric. Although I was suspicious, I answered, thinking there might be an issue with paperwork that needed attention. As soon as I answered, Eric shouted in a loud voice, "What is this all about?" It was just like the day they returned from their overseas trip. Wondering if there was anything else besides the furniture and appliances that could have angered my husband, I decided to listen closely. It turns out he had finally noticed the amount of the loan repayments when he opened a letter that had arrived at the house. He saw that the loan repayment amount was listed as $7,500 per month, which is why he called in a panic. "Wasn't the loan already paid off?" he exclaimed. "Of course not. The bank explained everything clearly, didn't they?" I replied. "That's impossible. I never heard about it." "With the fire insurance in your savings, why didn't you pay off the mortgage?" he shouted. "No way, that's impossible. Do you even realize how much that house was worth?" I responded. Shockingly, it seems Eric believed the mortgage was already paid off despite the bank's detailed explanation, which he had nodded to. He was apparently under a different impression. I was sitting right next to him, watching and listening, so I remember it well. Even if Eric wasn't paying attention, he had already signed the mortgage transfer, so it was too late now. Eric kept trying to find a way out of the mortgage payments, but there was nothing I could do about it. Eventually, he seemed to realize that he had no choice but to repay the loan and fell silent, seemingly frustrated. "I thought you'd be struggling to find a place to live," Eric said, clearly under the impression that I was in a dire situation. The reason Eric could freely spend his salary until now was because I was the one covering our living expenses. Even after our divorce, I have no trouble living on my own. It's too late for him to realize that he was relying on me for everything. I wondered what kind of life my pretentious ex-husband Eric had been leading these past few months with his parents, Rachel and Kyle. Most likely, they were living luxuriously, doing whatever Kelly suggested, and then he realized there was a mortgage to be paid. I wonder what Eric is going to do now, I thought, as if it were someone else's problem, since we're practically strangers now. I didn't care at all about how much trouble my ex-husband and his parents, Rachel and Kyle, were in. Seeing him so frustrated, I decided to tell him the truth. Too bad, I moved into a luxury condo with the money I made from a successful investment. While he was speechless, I hung up the phone. There were no calls from him after that, so I thought he had managed somehow. But then, out of the blue, he called again. When I answered, wondering what it was about this time, it turned out their house had been seized, and he was in a panic. In the background, I could hear the desperate voices of his parents, Rachel and Kyle, and his sister, Kelly. "What should I do? Help me, Lauren," my ex-husband pleaded desperately. A person claiming to be an enforcement officer was visiting their house, and I could hear Rachel, Kyle, and Kelly addressing the officer in the background. According to this officer, the house was about to be put up for auction, with details like the auction date and bidding period to be decided once the auctioneer was determined. After the ownership transferred, my ex-husband and his family would be evicted from the house. I thought they must have received warning letters leading up to this, but when I asked my ex-husband, he sounded confused and said they hadn't arrived. However, that couldn't be right, and after persistent questioning, he finally admitted in a small voice, maybe they did arrive. It turned out he had intentionally ignored the letters, realizing they were about loan repayments. The envelopes were already open before I saw them. I thought someone was taking care of the payments. Probably Rachel, Kyle, and Kelly thought the same as my ex-husband. Eventually, a demand for the lump sum repayment of the loan arrived, and it seems my ex-husband and his family were aware of it, but continued to ignore it, thinking someone else would pay it. And so, the house was finally seized. Can't you do something now, like pay it off? You could pull everyone's savings together. There's got to be a way, he begged. I couldn't hide my frustration at my ex-husband's helpless tone. When I suggested they pool their savings to pay off the loan, all he could say was, "It's impossible." Apparently, Rachel and Kyle had squandered their savings on an extravagant overseas trip and were planning to rely on their son, who they thought worked at a big company, for their future. It was all just their assumption. Kelly, his sister, who claimed she quit her job to come back home, was actually fired for embezzling company funds. She talked as if she had been hugely successful in the city, but in reality, she was just a modestly paid accountant in a small to mid-sized company. She got hooked on visiting nightclubs and gradually embezzled money from her company to splurge on them. Even though she had returned home, relying on her parents, Rachel and Kyle, she had the nerve to make grand claims. As for my ex-husband, after our divorce, he pretended to be working at a large corporation and started dipping into his savings to cover living expenses. Rachel, Kyle, and Kelly lived lavishly, and the money he had saved while we were married was completely gone. Then came the demand for the lump sum repayment of the loan. As their financial situations came to light, it seemed like the focus shifted from the court case to blaming each other. In the midst of this, my ex-husband started clinging to me. "Please, Lauren, you're living in that high-rise luxury condo now, right? Let's all live together there again." I refused. "We're divorced now, and as far as I'm concerned, we're strangers." Although I had felt a bit sorry for him earlier, I definitely didn't want to live with those people ever again. Hearing the voices of my ex-in-laws, Rachel, Kyle, and Kelly, in the background, I felt more resolved and firmly declined my ex-husband's offer. Upon hearing my refusal, Rachel, Kyle, and Kelly immediately started hurling insults at me. I heard various derogatory terms like heartless, scammer, and thief. Perhaps out of spite for being rejected, my ex-husband joined them in berating me. The noise over the phone was unbearable. Despite everything being the result of their own actions, there was no sign of remorse from them. Eventually, all four of them started blaming each other, leaving me out of it and arguing among themselves. I decided then and there to never involve myself with these people again. I quietly hung up the phone and blocked my ex-husband's number. A few days later, I came across a concerning headline in a corner of the newspaper. The article about a father and son getting into a fistfight and the police being called made me suspect it was about my ex-husband and his father. I decided to contact a mutual acquaintance who lives near my ex-in-law's home. Sure enough, the incident reported in the newspaper was about them, and it happened after I hung up the phone on my ex-husband. The article mentioned that a neighbor noticed the fight and called the police, leading to their arrest. My ex-husband, his father, Rachel, and Kelly, who tried to intervene, all sustained injuries that would take about 3 weeks to heal completely. After receiving a stern warning from the police, they were released. However, the incident making the newspapers meant my ex-husband faced severe reprimands at his workplace, although he wasn't fired. The cause of the fight was exaggerated and quickly spread throughout the company. My ex-husband feels uncomfortable at work, but can't afford to quite due to financial needs. Eventually, a buyer was found for their house, and they were forced to move out. They managed to find a new place, but it's an old, cramped, bug-infested apartment, a far cry from their previous home. The family of four began their new life there. Bugs appearing daily in the rooms are causing Kelly and Rachel to make such a fuss that they have already received complaints from the neighbors. They tried to work and rent a new house quickly, but both in-laws and Kelly seem to get into trouble at work and end up being fired. Especially Kelly, with her past of embezzling company funds becoming widely known, is finding it difficult to get rehired. It looks like they will have to continue living on my ex-husband's income alone. My ex-husband seems to be trying to find out where I live, asking our mutual acquaintances persistently. They have warned me to be careful. Even if my ex-husband finds my condo, he'll just be turned away by the full-time concierge. I gratefully accepted the advice from my acquaintance and made sure to ask the concierge to be on the lookout. With this, the turmoil with my ex-husband and his family finally comes to an end. It hasn't even been a year since I left that house, but it already feels like a distant past event. I've completely adapted to life in my luxury condo, enjoying my days filled with hobbies and work. I plan to enjoy my carefree single life for a while without thinking about marriage.